Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the first book discussion of the Central Asia Research Review Series, one of the many to come. My name is Nodira Kholmatova. I'm a sociologist and gender and migration researcher at the European University Institute in Florence. And today is my pleasure to moderate a discussion for an amazing book by Rustamjon, which is, by the way, available in open access for those who haven't seen it already yet. I will share the link a bit later in the chat for you to have an access. I would like to take a moment to introduce Rustamjon. He's an associate professor in the Department of Sociology of Law at Lund University and a senior researcher in Russian and Eurasian Studies at the University of Helsinki Aleksanteri Institute. Rustamjon works at the intersection of sociology of law and ethnography, studying migration, corruption, governance, and penal institutions in Russia and Central Asia. As it was mentioned earlier, to make our discussion interactive, we have also contributions from two more scholars who work on migration in Russia and Central Asia, Rano, Turaeva, and Sherzod Eraliev. I'll take a moment to introduce our discussants as well. Rano is not yet here, so we will wait for her. Sherzod Eraliev, a postdoctoral researcher at Aleksanteri Institute for Russian, European, and Eurasian Studies, University of Helsinki. At Aleksanteri Institute, Sherzod works on the research project on migration, shadow economy, and parallel legal orders in Russia. Sherzod mainly focuses on mobilities in Eurasia and on Central Asian migrants in Russia and in Turkey. Sherzod has recently published and co-authored several publications. I will mention just a few of them. He co-authored a book chapter with Rustamjon on informality and Uzbek migrant networks in Russia and Turkey, and the upcoming book on Central Asian world. And he also co-authored another chapter on Central Asian female migrants, transnational spaces, straddling illegality and tradition. Very warm welcome, Sherzod. And I would like to introduce Rano Turaeva, and hopefully she will join us soon. Rano Turaeva is a habilitating candidate at the LMU in Munich, and an associate researcher at Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle Saale in Germany. She is currently working on the second book on migration and Islam in Russia. Her recent co-authored book is on labor mobility and informal practices in Russia, power institutions, and moral actors in transnational space. She works on such topics as migrant entrepreneurship, gender, informal economy, among many other topics, and she publishes in such journals as Inner Asia, Communist and Post-Communist Studies, Sociology of Islam, among many others. So a few words about the agenda. We will give the floor to the discussants first. We'll start with Sherzod, and hopefully Rano will join us. And then Rustamjon will have a chance to react, to address the questions, the points raised by discussants, and then we're going to have a Q&A session. But the questions are already welcome by now because we only have 1 hour. And later on, when the session kicks in, I will collect the questions and address them with Erica to Rustamjon. And as it was mentioned earlier, to make the discussion accessible, we welcome questions in English, in Russian, in Uzbek. So without further ado, I give the floor to Sherzod.
Thank you very much, Nodira. I'm really pleased to see so many people online, and it's my really sincere honor to talk about the book. And I take again one more chance to congratulate Rustamjon on the publication of this very important book. And without further ado, I would like to share, maybe restate the main arguments of the book, and also ask Rustamjon on official, for those, for the general audience, I should say that we have recently worked with Rustam quite in cooperation. I know a lot of his opinions, and I'm often inspired by his work, by his publications, and by his ideas. So it would be just one more so-called semi-official way of how I accepted the book, how I see this important book. This book, as all we know, examines migrants' adaptation and integration in politically hybrid regimes. Rustam considers his book as a critical reflection on the dominant migrant legal adaptation and integration literature, which is still, we know, largely based on case studies of immigrant communities in Western-style democracies, be it North American countries or Western European countries. The author argues that we know relatively little about how migrants adapt to new legal environments in the ever-growing hybrid political regimes that are neither clearly democratic nor conventionally authoritarian. By calling Russia a hybrid regime, Rustamjon refers to a weak rule of law, dysfunctional institutions, a widespread corruption, large shadow economies, and a poor human rights record, and of course, a weak civil society. As in other countries, Russia produces insecure and illegal ambiguous migration statuses through inconsistent and arbitrary law enforcement, which serve to keep migrant workers submissive. In other words, Russian immigration laws and policies are so restrictive that migrants easily become illegal or undocumented, as we mostly use the term in academia. But what Rustam argues is that migrants are not just passive or agency-less subjects constrained by a restrictive legal environment. Instead, migrants do have agency, and they use that agency and the opportunities provided by a weak rule of law and a corrupt political system to navigate this legal landscape using informal channels to access employment or to get their things done that are limited in the current legal framework of the Russian society. In the Russian context, undocumentedness is a conscious adaptation strategy for migrants rather than a dead end. Migrants do not deal with the rule of law, but experience corrupt legal environment that enables them to produce various informal strategies and tactics to maneuver around legal uncertainties and arbitrary law enforcement. And he uses, for this, he uses the case of Uzbek migrants. And as we know from the book, we have quite the heroes of the life stories on which the book is based. Most of them hail from the Fergana Valley, where Rustam is from, and to understand the migrant legal adaptation strategies, Rustam proposes to move beyond conventional Western-based legal centralistic perspectives. As we know, legal centralist perspectives, they emphasize migrants' legal status, their compliance with the host country's immigration laws, their ability to engage in claim making, in other words, the rule of law. To understand migrant legal adaptation in hybrid political regimes such as Russia, the author proposed to employ the ethnographically embedded and legally pluralistic perspectives that incorporates informality and a weak rule of law as key analytical factors. By legal pluralism, Rustam here emphasizes the coexistence and clash of multiple sets of rules that mold people's social behavior, the law of the nation state, indigenous customs and rules, religious decrees, moral codes, and practical norms for social life. So a set of different sets of rules which gives us legal pluralism. Legal adaptations of migrant workers in Russia, the author argues that we should not understand it as only through migrants' legalization efforts and involvement with state institutions, but also in terms of their knowledge of street law, informal rules, connections to street institutions, and of course, migrants' capacity to integrate into the corrupt and weak rule of law environment. Thus, drawing on the legal pluralism perspective, the author proposes a new framework, suggesting that the law and legal adaptation should be defined more broadly beyond state immigration laws, policies, and institutions, and encompass informal legal orders. These informal legal orders include migrants' agency and their legal baggage, which is like informal and non-legal practices, rules, strategies, and networks, and used by migrants to follow, avoid, or maneuver around the law. And second, the informal or rent-seeking behaviors and practices among state officials. That by state officials, here he refers to immigration officers, police officers, or border guards, or any other Russian officials that are included in migration policies in Russia. And we have another level of this legal pluralistic perspective is street institutions. As we know, we have very much, Rustam very much talks about this, racketeers, intermediaries, and former law enforcement officers, who use to enforce contracts enforcement or death cover or conflict resolution issues. And we have also transnational networks, interactions, and pressures that shape migrants' experiences in the whole society. And last, we have this. The 4 levels. And as the author argues, by using this legally pluralistic framework and accounting for the hybrid political regime characteristics, we arrive at rather different conclusions, whereby migrants in Russia are active and resilient actors capable of inventing various informal strategies to adapt to the restrictive legal environment and organize their working life and tackle uncertainties and risks by producing this informal legal order. And this through legal baggage framework, Rustam also demonstrates how mahalla level norms, identities, reciprocal relations, and social sanctions continue to shape Uzbek migrants' lives even when they move to Russia or anywhere else. Thus, Uzbek migrants, they import and adapt their pre-migratory cultural and normative repertoires to Russia, especially when they work and live under the conditions of shadow economy, that requires alternative forms of law and order. As we know, for many migrants, the state it remains absent not only in Uzbekistan but also in Russia, where they live largely isolated lives with few opportunities to to interact with the local population. And rather than in this regard, rather than integrating into the host society, migrants rely on alternative paths to adaptation, employing networks based on kinship, shared village origins, ethnicity, or religion. So migration is under the conditions of legal uncertainty and precarity, requires the reproduction and maintenance of transnational identities and relationships that act as forms of social safety nets when migrants face hardships. And through the I should say extraordinary life stories of Uzbek migrants, Rustam demonstrates how migrants seek redress from street-level actors, such as, for example, Chechen racketeers or Caucasian racketeers or former employees of law enforcement agencies who provides alternative to state forms of contract employment enforcement, debt recovery, or dispute settlements. This way, the author uncovers to us an informal parallel world of migrants based on its own non-codified, but at the same time, socially reproduced and legitimate forms of governance and legal order. And I think this is one of the few ethnographic works that uncovers the real world of migrants and how they live, especially, I mean, we are here talking about Uzbek migrants, and how they live, what their everyday coping strategies are.
I'm sorry, yes. I have to pause you now and ask you to wrap up because you were giving each about 10 minutes, but given that Rano is not here, we allowed you to continue, but could you please wrap it up and then we have a chance for Rustamjon to react.
Okay, good. Well, I should say, I would just say the final thoughts then. I think the book extends the state of the art by examining labor migrants' relations with the law and law-like structures in Russia, thereby contributing new theoretical insights on migrants' socio-legal integration and comparative material that lies beyond the Western experience. In this regard, I believe this is a very important contribution to the state of art on migration regime on migration studies of non-Western migration regimes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sherzod. Thank you. Rustamjon, would you like to take a moment to react to the comments?
Thank you very much. I think Sherzod provided a very good summary of the book's key arguments, and I agree with him. And I think it's. I look forward to receiving more comments, questions, if Sherzod has any. Otherwise, I think it was a very nice summary. Thank you, Sherzod.
Yes, I know. We have discussed your book a lot, even in the process of your preparing for the publication. But still, I would ask, for example, I know you focus mostly on Uzbek migrants. And nevertheless, could you see these differences in terms of legal adaptation and integration strategies, how Uzbek migrants have used in Russia, those the differences or similarities of those adaptation and integration strategies between Uzbek and Kyrgyz or Tajik migrant groups, for example?
Thank you very much, Sherzod. I think this is a very important question. And first, I think I should emphasize that my ethnographic study mainly focuses on the experiences of Uzbek migrants in Russia, and I have not studied in-depth experience of Kyrgyz or Tajik migrants. Nevertheless, if we still we can rely on the results of other studies conducted by Madin Reeves, Malika Bohovatinova, and Sergei Abashin and others. And I think based on the review of relevant literature on this subject, I can see parallels, the similar experiences that Tajik and Kyrgyz migrants also experience in Russia. So because they are all part of the similar socio-legal environment in Russia, and they all need to deal with the same structural problems. And so in this case, I think based on the results of other studies, I would argue that my results not only common to Uzbeks, but it can also be extended to the experience of other migrant communities in Russia. And in addition, I would like to add that in 2015, I conducted 100 semi-structured interviews with different migrants working in Moscow and Podmoskovia. And in my sample, I had Kyrgyz and Tajik migrants also. And also I had migrants beyond my village sample, where I covered migrants coming from Uzbekistan's different provinces. And so I had some kind of variety. And also my informants, Uzbeks, they also had friends, networks. They were connected to Kyrgyz and Tajik migrant communities. So to some degree, more or less, I was in a web of different, networks in Moscow. And so my impression is that things, the legal experiences I described in my book has also implications for understanding the experience of other migrant communities. But having said that, I should emphasize that in my book, I'm mainly covering the experience of male migrant workers. So there is a problem with the gender dimension, and this of course has to do with my own gender as a male, because it was so difficult to gain access to female informants, because very often they accompanied their husbands, or in some other cases, I think it was difficult to gain access to female informants. So this is one of the limitations of my book, and I hope that others would address the gender dimension with more in-depth ethnographic studies. And I think there are many now. It's emerging. And for example, your recent article in Routledge volume, I think you show that female migrants they have different experiences. So that's I think something that I need to mention in my book, Limitations. Yes, thank you. If you have more questions, please.
About this agency, I mean, that may not be as always the case, as we have discussed earlier. And in the book chapter you've mentioned, we have covered a couple of cases when female migrants did not actually have an agency, and that could also depend on different contextual factors as well. And I should maybe I still have a couple of maybe questions, but maybe we give the floor to the audience, and if there is no, if we will still have time, I would like to ask them. But otherwise, Nodira, please feel free to give the floor to others.
We have actually quite a couple of questions, and I think Erika wanted to ask the first question, and then I have like 3 more questions waiting. I will try to collect them now.
Thank you so much, Rustamjon and Sherzod. Thank you for your discussion. So my question is, Rustamjon, what are the bigger pressures? Is it more the formal pressures from the state or the informal world? And obviously from your book, we can see that migrants navigate both the formal and informal. What do you think are the greatest pressures? Thank you. And you can go ahead and ask other questions as well, Nodira.
I think this.
Would you like to collect or go one by one?
I think it's better if I address one by one. Otherwise,
As you wish. Okay.
Keep track. Yeah, and Eric, I think this is a very important question, and this is, I think, it's hard to say which one affects more, because on the one hand we have a very restrictive legal system, immigration legal regime in Russia, and for migrant workers it's really hard to be legal, considering the costs of legalization, also at the same time the inconsistencies and ambiguities in immigration laws. So, for example, we have, Russian, the Duma and the legislators, they are passing the law. And on the other hand, we have a Federal Migration Service, they are passing their own internal, instructions, Podzakonye Akte. And then they are already inconsistent and they contradict in many ways. And this Podzakonye Akte, they are usually in the offices of immigration officials, and then even lawyers, immigration lawyers, have a hard time accessing these documents. So this is a formal side, and then there is still ambiguity. And the informal side, even if migrants possess all the documents needed to be legal, but then we have arbitrary law enforcement and immigration officials, border guards and police officers stopping migrants on the street. They have also, a lot of discretionary power, and even with perfectly clean documents, it's hard to be legally. So it's both, I think. So that's why one of the key arguments I put forward in the book is that it's impossible to be fully legal in Russian context. And many migrants I covered in my study, instead of trying to be legal, which is nearly impossible, migrants are resorting to informality, using different street-based channels in order to navigate the system. And then, so this is a pattern I observed in the lives of many migrants I studied. Thank you. We have Rano.
We would like to ask 3 questions that were raised, and then give a floor to Rano to briefly comment on your book as it was initially planned. And one of the comments, and I would like to read 2 of them together, says that there are similarities of experience with other migrants elsewhere in the Western countries in your book. There should be some similarities despite the specific dynamics of Central Asia. I think the author is asking whether you map your book in migration studies and illegality in the whole perspective, right? Not just Central Asia. And the second question is, you use quite a strong language in your book. You talk about the hidden world of migrants. Don't you think this can contribute to xenophobic sentiments of Russia? How would this book be read by an average Russian immigration official or, for example, policymaker?
These are 2 important questions. And first question is, I think by ethnographically attending to the experiences of Uzbek migrants and their, navigation and experiences in shadow economy, I'm, of course, connecting to broader debates in migration studies about migrant undocumentedness, informality, and I think that my study is contributing to this broader debate through the example of Central Asian migrants. And of course, there are specifics connected with Russian case, but in a broader perspective, my ambition with this book was to contribute new empirical insights to the broader literature. So that was one of the aims, and also that's why I also reflected on my ambition in the title of the book by calling it Migration and Hybrid Political Regimes. And so I tried to move beyond the area studies, approach by also choosing this title also. Then second question, I think this is I agree with Yelena Borisova that I indeed use a quite strong language in my book, and of course, when there is a hidden world of migrants, and I have some other publications where I talk about how migrants are using smartphones and social media to create their own virtual community. For example, many Uzbek migrants I studied, they are located in different parts of Moscow province. They are scattered around Moscow, but they have a smartphone-based, village communities, and they are more or less solving problems through smartphones. And then this is one of the, the hidden communities which operates, through smartphones. And of course, like in Istanbul, there is a separate Uzbek enclave, and there you see ethnic, concentration of Uzbeks in one neighborhood in Istanbul, but in Moscow we don't see that kind of ethnic enclave. Migrants are scattered around, and even Uzbek cafes and chaykhanas, they are not tied to specific locality, but you find Uzbek chaykhanas in different parts of Moscow. So in this sense, I think I more or less I am talking about hidden world of migrants, but they are invisible in the sense that they operate through smartphones. And there is, by the way, only one kind of ethnic enclave, which is a food city in Moscow. This is where, of course, we find lots of Uzbeks there. But I think it's unlikely that state officials, policymakers would touch this bazaar, because according to rumors, it belongs to very high level official in Russian Federal Security Service. So there are many economic interests around it. But of course, there is a risk that my use of the terms and language might be misinterpreted, used in some other ways to reinforce xenophobic sentiments in Russia. There is a risk, and I think that she is right. Yes, more questions?
Thank you. I would like, there are 2 more questions pending, but I would like to give the floor to Rano Turaeva, just for 5 minutes though, to address your comments, and then we'll go back to, you will be reaction to Rano, and then we'll continue with the questions.
Rano, your microphone is muted, unmute.
Now is it now? Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much that I have the opportunity to discuss this really very nice book. And I'm very sorry for these technical problems caused because I'm on the way. And that's why I'm dependent on the internet of my telephone. So I'm very sorry about it. But actually, I'm sorry that I missed the discussion, but what I wanted to actually address in my discussion of Rustam's book was more theoretical. I don't know how much you discussed, which aspects you discussed, but I would stop on this theory, which really fascinated me. It has, of course, to do also with his methodology, which is really fascinating. When I was reading through his case study of these construction workers, and they're dealing with solving the justice, so to say, and their rules, which worked in practice. So he was considering this conflict situation where these construction workers of, I think he's Misha, and he had to arrange this his brigada in Moscow, and they were not paid, and they applied the rule of street laws, and the brigada came with the Chechens, and the Misha came with Omons, who are of course part of the official security system in Russia, which basically worked, but outside that, the village pressure at the end won the situation of justice. So this reminds me of my own materials that I was discussing, the same problems where this kind of justice dilemmas were solved through the kinship, through the connections at home, and through this kind of social control at a home context. It's really fascinating. And there I was also talking about how do you deal in a dilemma situation, which I used in my case, a trader's dilemma. How do you solve the economic problem where you cannot sell to your own people, because then you are somehow bound to your own people with your own responsibilities? Then you have this kind of situation of trader's dilemma, which is really fascinating. And I found the methodology that was followed by Rustam, that he goes back to the village and to see how they how the family solves the problem, and then he goes back to the construction workers, and he really describes really with the ethnographic details and very rich material, and he shows really the situation of this legal plural situation, but in a transnational context. It's really fascinating that he really deals with the transnational context and also shows us how the real legal pluralism works in practice. So that's, I think there are some definitional problems I had. I think there would be maybe some definitions could be helpful, but how this conceptually is really how thought through, that he really shows us how the street laws function and what kind of actors are participating, like these Oman people without uniforms. I mean, this is really fascinating. And these Chechens' roles in these street politics, and at the end, this village wins. It's really fascinating. And I think
Rano, you have 1 minute to address any other questions.
So I have only one question then to just finalize what I wanted to ask is, like, how do you then, in this, you are describing this kind of legal plural context. So what is the definition of legal, and what is the definition of law then? And that would be my question, and I think the other questions I can ask them.
What did you say first? Legal, and the second, what did you say? Legal.
Definition of the law. Definition of the law and definition of the legal.
Yes, this is. I thank you very much, Rano, for your very valuable feedback, comments, and I'm very honored that you like this transnational fieldwork, and I should be thankful to Swedish Research Council for financing all these trips, which made this data possible. And about the legal pluralism, I think in my case, I just took the standard definition of the legal pluralism provided by Sally Engel Mary, and then this is what you find, that law is not just state law, but it's also about customs, traditions, indigenous norms, religious beliefs, etiquette, customs, and then this is how I interpreted legal pluralism, just taking the standard definition. And of course, there is also a lot of contradictions, debates, and inside the legal pluralism debates. But what I did, I just took the definition that is more or less used in different publications. So I didn't go deep in that sense. I mean, within the legal pluralism literature. And of course, we have here more experienced, researchers like Catherine Handley. She joined, and she's the one. I think she's more familiar with legal pluralism debates, and I think she has also conducted studies about Russian legal culture. And about this, this street life, and just some kind of information. I have recently conducted 29 interviews with Uzbek ex-prisoners who served prison sentences in Russian penal institutions last 10 years, and then I think many of the insights, the data that I observed in relation to street law, I think have been confirmed in my recent interviews, that it's indeed shadow economy, and the prison is so much interconnected that they are complementing each other in terms of, dispute settlement and, providing solidarity, social safety nets to Uzbeks who are located outside in the labor market, also inside in the Russian prison penal institutions. Thank you, Rano. I hope I have answered your question to some degree.
There are two follow-up questions. First, in regard to the concepts as well. So there's a question, what's the reason behind choosing the concept of legal adaptation in comparison to other types of adaptation, and what those would be? And why you have chosen specifically judicial aspect of lives in migration, in migrants' lives. And there's one more question that kind of follows, but it looks a bit deeper into your data. How do you describe relationship between migrants and the police? how do you discuss these issues related to systemic racism, and some suggestions maybe you could share on how to address the justice system and oppressive system from your point of view? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And two important questions. And Malika is asking about why I use legal adaptation. This has to do with my PhD education, and I am a sociologist of law by training. And here in this department, we are obsessed with studying the difference between law in books and law in action, more or less living law. And then as a sociologist of law, my starting point, I mean, when I started fieldwork, of course, I didn't have any theory to test, but I had a kind of socio-legal living law informed, approach. And then I wanted to study how migrants adapt to the legal environment, and how laws are written, and how things work in real life situation. So this was my starting point. And then I used this term legal adaptation. I mean, more or less, I mean, if you broaden it, how migrants build a relationship with the law and law-like structures in Russia. This was, starting point of my project also. This is for what I think I got funding from Swedish Research Council to study this. So this was a brief, more or less, background of why I did this juridical, aspect of the lives in migration. And second question about systemic racism and police. And of course, in my book, I didn't, of course, I tried to understand the agency of migrants, and of course, the police is present in every corner of Moscow. When migrants go out and if they want to buy some food products from the supermarket or a small store, all of a sudden police officers present around, and then they are just inescapable presence in migrants' lives. But what I try to understand is how migrants try to negotiate the rules of the game with police officers. I try to go beyond the victimology approach, and I try to understand how things work. And very often migrants, one typical standard explanation, from my interviews is that police officers, they are not interested in deporting migrants to Uzbekistan. Their main interest is to have as many illegal migrants as possible in Moscow, because this is a source of money, source of kormushka for many police officers. So that's why if there is no any immigration rate, if there is no any pressure from their superiors, the police officers are always interested in getting 1,000 or 2,000 rubles, and they release the migrant workers immediately after they get money. And one interesting aspect is that one migrant is sitting inside the police station, and then another migrant without any documents, he can come to the police station and he can pay the bribe for the person sitting inside the camera cell, and then he can release. So there are so many informal rules surrounding the migrant police interactions, and so I think I wanted to also show these processes. So the situation is not just simple. So it's more about how migrants get the things done through using informal channels. Yes, I hope I have answered. More questions?
Yes, there's one more question that's related to COVID. And before I switch to that, I would like to, I think, pose my own question as well. And that also has to do with the system of oppression and racism. And generally, it would be interesting to hear about your take on the theory of racism in the context of Russia, for example, because, for example, such anthropologists as Barak Aliyev, who talk about the illegalizing immigration, and by looking at the apparatus, how it, so you look at the lived experience of the migrants, right, and how they negotiate, how they navigate, and you want to show all the spectrum of the strategies the migrants come up with on daily basis, adapting and being proactive, right? At the same time, and then you look at racism from everyday experience. I'm just curious to hear about your thoughts about the system, right? The apparatus, that's functioning in Russia. That's actually by illegalizing immigration, like you said, they make money on it, etc. But at the same time, I feel like you could have pushed a bit harder and further the struggle of the migrants. It's the everyday livelihood is about the struggle, right? So it's although you say about the agency, how they're proactive, how they find innovative ways by making networks, etc. But would you have something to elaborate on how this system of oppression, the racism that is embodied in the apparatus itself, right, makes the whole migration regime, this hybrid regime, right, the everyday reality, not just the migrants themselves, because you look at male, but their families and everyone who is involved in the system, right? If my point is clear. And then I can ask the question about the COVID, because we have 10 minutes left.
I think this is this everyday experience of migrants I present is just a part of the small part of the bigger picture that we find in the Russian system. I think it's migrant experience, of course, is a lens to look into the operation of Russian police legal system and police system, and of course, I mean, it's more or less it's a Russian, it's based on it's apparatus which is based on the racism, and then you see even those police officers, you know, they are taking money from migrants. I think they are more or less, I think they are based on this racist ideology also. This is, I think, something that I didn't cover because I was mainly interested in the everyday experience of migrants, and this is something I think I should probably reflect more in my future work. And yeah, I think this is important thing to consider in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Rustamjon. I have more questions coming. Your topic in your book is super interesting. So the one of the questions, again, going back to your data, to your fieldwork, which city would you consider is easier for Uzbek migrants? Istanbul? Would it be Istanbul, for example, if because of the Muslim background, or Moscow because of common Soviet past? Where do they get better adaptation? So, and there's one more question. If you could make a broader argument about law, Russian immigration law. It's a very, very general question.
It's about, with Sherzod Eraliev, we are currently working on the second book project. It's a comparative study of Central Asian migrants' experiences in Istanbul and Moscow. That's something we are working on, and we have recently written one paper for Madeleine Reeves' volume on Central Asian world. And in this book, we are actually addressing this question: which city is better, Istanbul or Moscow? And then one of the informants in our fieldwork came up with a very innovative explanation of which city is better. So I first tell this in Uzbek, so that they say, Türk'te iman var, lekin insaf yok. Orus'ta iman yok, lekin insaf var. So this means like Turks are Muslims, but they have no justness. So they have no justice. Russians are non-Muslims, in Uzbek infidels. Sorry, but they have a justice. So they are just, they are fair. So this is what Uzbeks referred. And then we used the case study of Pulat, who worked both in Moscow and in Istanbul. And then he, of course, in Istanbul, he didn't have to pay bribes to Russian to police officers. He could work without patent, without work permit, and he enjoyed free mobility in the city. But one thing that he complained was labor exploitation and long working hours and impossibility of getting salary in case you are cheated. So then he also reflected on his experiences in our fieldwork, that even though Moscow was repressive in terms of police officers and, you know, informality, corruption, but he still preferred Moscow to Istanbul. This is because he had he had better networks, more kinship structures in Moscow. He also had better working conditions in terms, he worked less hours but made more money in Moscow. So in this sense, I think using the case of Polat, we demonstrate that the common religion and ethnicity is not the main factor explaining which city is more preferable, but it's more about migrants' kinship networks and also availability of mechanisms in case migrants cannot get salary. And Polat, in our case, he referred a lot to the kinship networks and the existence of street institutions in Moscow, which provided economic security to him. So this is one example from our fieldwork. What was the second question? So it's here. I missed that.
Yeah, it was a bit broad. It was more about from your book, the broader argument of your book about the law and immigration system in Russia, basically. The overarching argument when it comes to law in Russia and immigration.
Yeah. In my book, I had different, aims, and because this book is kind of interdisciplinary in the sense that I tried to reach out to different disciplines, to sociology of law, to migration studies, and Russian and Central Asian studies. But the broader argument is that if the migrant legal adaptation should be understood not just in reference to migrants' legal status and legalization strategies, but we also need to look at informal avenues of adaptations, street law and informal practices if you want to understand how migrants adapt to legal environment in a weak rule of law regimes like Russia. So because my argument was that much of the migration studies literature, especially socio-legal studies of migration, they are based on the case studies of migrants in Western style democracies. And then I wanted to broaden the lens, and then I brought the example of Russia, where we see different adaptation pattern, which is based on informality and street law based adaptations. This is one of the key arguments that I try to reach out to migration studies. In terms of Russian studies, I think I'm more or less connected to informality debates about Russian legal culture and then shadow economy debates. And so I think there is not much I can say in that regard, because the migrants' experience I described is also common to typical Russian citizens, because they also navigate a similar legal system in Russia. And then I also try to contribute to Central Asian studies by talking about legal culture in Central Asia and how it's exported to Russian context and how it comes to interplay with the new legal system. And then this was so that's why in my book I have different aims. I'm reaching out, and it depends on who reads my book. If Central Asian studies scholar read, they see it different. Sociologists of law, they have a different analysis of the book. So it depends who reads.
If I ask one last question, following on that, and then we'll wrap it up 1 minute before the 5. So you mentioned there is formal structures, push for more informality. Can you say a bit more if there were any clashes between the legal and some customary law among the migrants? Clashes between the legal and some customary law among the migrants on their daily experiences. If you could remember anything from your analysis and data.
Migrants, for example, in the case of chapter number 4, Misha, then you see how migrants are also trying to relate themselves to the state law. For example, they use different, forms of the law normativity to influence Misha's behavior. One was through the Chechens street law. They used village pressure, and then then migrants, they were also going to contact Uzbek law enforcement, Uzbek security service and police in case village pressure doesn't work. So in this sense, I think migrants, they were playing around different legal systems, they were part, so they used depending on the situation. And also, for example, one thing that about clash and norms, this is not mentioned in my book, but I remember the case of Bakhtiar. He's a registration guy. He's a document intermediary working in Moscow's Otradny metro. He's no longer working there, so I can mention now. So one day, he contacted me and asked if I can give the phone number of a migrant rights lawyer in Moscow. Because before that he met, I was accompanied by some migrant rights lawyers, and I came to Chaykhana and we had a lunch there, and this is how he got information that I was connected to migrant rights lawyers in Moscow. Then he asked, Rustam, do you think your contacts can help me? Then I said, of course, you should contact migrant rights lawyer if there is a problem with a salary or something. Then he said that I don't think that this migrant rights lawyer can help me because I have a connection at the Russian FSB, Federal Security Service. I contacted him informally and he couldn't solve the problem. And I don't think that your lawyers, they can fix it because even this FSB guy couldn't fix it. So because this is the same, behavior in Uzbekistan, people, they don't want to go to the courts because they are legal. They have a reluctance to approach a formal state institution because they think that it's too much time consuming and there is no trust in the formal legal system. But Uzbeks always want to have some kind of connection, informal contact that who can solve all the problems, And then you see when you go to Moscow, when I advise them to go to lawyer and then try to solve problems through formal channels, they always laughed at me and they said that I am very naive and that I should try to be more realistic. And then they were always trying to use informal channels in their daily life. So this is how their legal consciousness, the legal culture was formed because they were still relying on the legal repertoire, norms that they brought with them to Moscow from Uzbekistan. So then you could see the clash between, this different legal, mentalities in the mindset of migrants.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up. I have more questions waiting, but we had 1 hour set. Thank you very much, Rustamjon, Sherzod, and Rano for this amazing discussion.